Ever since Clan Selection 1 released, a lot of people are suddenly really into Standard, or V Premium if you will. You know, playtesting a lot, playing with the new decks a lot. We got 12 different supports for 12 different clans, and some of those supporting cards go between different builds. And with Clan Selection 2 on the horizon for the other 12 clans, a lot of people are super excited to play Standard because this feels like the most balanced the format has ever been. There's so many decks that are at the top that can either like match some of the best decks or be able to like counter them or play, you know, on the same footing as them. And with Springfest coming up, a lot of people know that if you want to start playtesting for Springfest already, the only format that you can really playtest right now is Standard, because Premium is going to change a lot with the Overdress cards, and Overdress is, you know, only what we know right now. However, with the people that want to playtest for Standard, myself included, there is one boogeyman. There is one boogeyman that a lot of people know that they have to get over and that they have to beat in order to go properly competitive in Standard right now, or in Vimium, and that is of course one of my actual favorite units ever, Gavrail. So we have not done one of these in a really long time, but today we're going to be talking about how to beat Gavriel, the sort of big spoopy deck that dominates Standard, at least in the West. You know, in Japan they already kind of downplay it. They say it's a tier 3 deck and stuff like that, and that it's just a lottery machine and all those things. But of course, we are talking for Western Championships, and if you look at a lot of remote fight tournament results, Gavriel is still at the top and still dominating pretty hard. So first things first, what makes Gavriel so scary? Why is she dominating tournaments, and why do people feel particularly kind of salty about this deck as well? Well, because their win con is a card named Hamiel, which you actually saw in the thumbnail. Hamiel isn't a particularly complex card or anything of that sort. She simply says when she attacks, you can count them as 3 to give her 15k in a crit, and then your opponent cannot guard with sentinels, and she goes to the soul after that battle. So 27k with a crit, that's not that scary, is it? Of course not. But the entire deck around it makes her incredibly frightening. So if you don't know, or if you do know, you need a reminder, the Gavriel deck basically uses something called rescue checks, where basically it either adds damage to hand, or superior calls it, or heals it, or puts on the bottom of the deck, or whatever else, in order to then deal itself damage for the amount that was like put into your hand or called or whatever. And every time you deal yourself a damage, you can activate those triggers. Gavriel decks play 16 crit, therefore they're able to, you know, check a bunch of crits more than any other deck, and they can do a total of 6 of these rescue checks plus their 2 drive checks, therefore go through 8 cards per turn, and then put any of those critical triggers on the Hamiel, who cannot be guarded with sentinels, therefore making this a super big attack that cannot be guarded with perfect guards, that needs to be guarded with regular cards, that can sometimes go up to 6 crit, and therefore 0-6 your opponent in Standard. But then you say, of course, I mean, that's a great card and all, but it needs counterblast 3 to set up. You can just damage deny them, right? Well, yes and no. If you give even 1 damage to a Gavriel deck, they can use Gavriel's skill to counterblast 1, soul blast 1, to then take 1 of the damages that was counterblasted into their hand, and you do as much of the skill as possible, because the cost is counterblast, soul blast 1. So you take 1 of the damage into your hand, you don't have anything left to put on the bottom of the deck, and then you still deal yourself 2 damage, so therefore you go to 2 damage already. And then you can use Holy Seraph No Seal's effect to soul blast 1, search your deck for No Seal, put it into your damage, there you go, you now have 3 damage, and you're ready to use the Hamiel. And of course, if you ignore that entire damage deny mechanic and you basically just like try to push them early, they're gonna just be able to use Hamiel's counterblast 3 without any extra effort, and they can dedicate all of their costs to using as many damage checks from the rescue checks as possible to putting those crits on Hamiel and defeating you on that turn. Another thing with giving Gavriel even 1 counterblast in the early game is that it turns on Yafkiel, which is when you place it, you can counterblast 1, add a card from your damage zone to your hand, and then deal yourself 1 damage. So you can ride this card, counterblast 1, add the card, counterblast the card to your hand, deal a damage, oh, you check a crit. Now your opponent has to deal, or you as the opponent have to deal with a crit 2 Hamiel attacking for 22k, and if they want to, they can push that even more with more rescue checks depending on their hand, and already push you for a lot of damage in the early game, so you can't just like guard everything and then take the Hamiel next turn either. Another thing is that giving 1 counterblast to a Gavriel player also means that they turn on the grade 2 No Seal, who says she can counterblast 1, soul blast 1, and then search her deck for any No Seal and add the counterblasted card to the hand. And then you can use other effects to search out that No Seal from your damage zone and then use it next turn to give yourself the 3rd damage to actually use Hamiel. So basically giving them even 1 counterblast already turns on 2 key cards, and also turns on their win con because Gavriel can push yourself to 2, and then you just use No Seal to push yourself to 3. So giving them 2 damage, they're going to push themselves to 3. Give them 1 damage, they can still push even further. So that kind of leaves us with one answer for most decks that can actually play against this, and that is to not give them any damage at all until their 3rd turn. But how do you not give them any damage? I mean, you have to attack to put drive checks to your hand, right? Well, certain decks have the option to still attack and therefore add drive checks to hand by swinging under. If you're a premium player, then you're probably pretty familiar with this mechanic of just basically riding something that is a lower power than your opponent's Vanguard by playing lower power cards in your deck to then swing, and then you have called a rearguard somewhere to put any trigger powers on it so that it doesn't deal damage to your Vanguard no matter what. For example, in a Luar deck, you could ride the 5k Owl in order to then call something else to the back row and then attack with that Owl against the Gavriel players like 7k or 8k grade 1 and put any trigger powers to the back row rearguard in order to not give them any damage while still adding cards to your hand from the drive check. However, not a lot of decks in the current meta actually have that many cards that are less than 8k power on grade 1 or less than 9k power on grade 2, and therefore you are faced with the decision, do I just pass? And against Gavriel, that is the answer. You simply pass on turns 1 and 2. By passing on turn 1 going second, you don't give them that first damage to use Yafkill and then later use Gavriel. By passing on turn 2, you don't allow for that to happen either, nor do you let them actually have that one counterblast to use Gavriel's skills to push to 2 and then to push to 3 with no CL to then use Hamiel and destroy you. So you literally have to pass or swing under on turns 1 and 2 and simply ignore what your deck wants to do. It's kind of like playing against Chaos, right? Against Link Joker that can lock your field. You don't just like play down units and do what your deck wants to do because they're going to get locked and you're going to lose. You have to tread carefully and be careful against that matchup and then bounce back after you farmed enough resources or played around the mechanic well enough. So then you must be thinking, okay, I just lost 2 cards from not drive checking there for those 2 turns. How am I going to beat Gavriel? Like, they can still just do their win con 1 turn later. Yes and no, because quite a lot of decks in this meta in Standard can generate a lot of resources on their first grade 3 turn. Basically, most of the grade 3 bosses in Standard right now either function as a card themselves or function as a engine that enables other effects to draw you a bunch of cards. So you can think of stuff like Luar that Superior calls a bunch of them draws into cards. You can think of Chronojet that basically has a draw effect stapled onto like almost every other card in the deck. Bermuda Triangle, Nairos, like there's actually quite a lot of decks right now, even some of the lower tier ones. Hell, I can think of like Malkuth Melik of all things. There's a lot of decks right now that can actually farm a lot of resources on their turn 3. So what generally happens is that you pass on turn 1, you pass on turn 2, not give them any damage, so all they can really do in their turn 3 is like ride up, call something, swing, 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 maybe check a double crit. It's like, wow, okay, then I mean, that's just like any deck can do that. But then you need to use your first grade 3 turn to farm as many resources as possible. And by farming all those cards into your hand, even drawing triggers is honestly like one of the best things that can happen to you in this situation. You farm so many resources while pushing aggro to your opponent that now you've taken the Gavriel player to somewhere maybe like 3 damage or so, and they're like, okay, now I can use my Hamiel. But by the time that they start turning on that Hamiel and putting crits on it, you farmed a big enough of a hand that you can actually guard her and then take the other attacks and then be on like 5 damage or something and clap back on turn 4, because they had to probably put down a lot of cards for that Hamiel turn to enable all the rescues and in order to actually put all those crits onto the Hamiel or gamble for them at least. And right now that is probably the best strategy you can use. So next time you play against Gavriel, just keep that in mind. But there is still one more caveat, and that is Holy Seraph no CL. Even if you don't attack turns 1 and 2, what they can unfortunately do is use Holy Seraph no CL by just calling it out, Soul Blasting 1, and putting a no CL into the damage zone for that turn. They can then again use Gavriel's skill, Counterblast 1, Soul Blast 1, push themselves to 2, but then they have to have another Holy Seraph no CL to push themselves to 3. So they have to use 2 Holy Seraph no CLs in a turn. Some decks run 3, some decks run 4 even to make sure that actually happens. And Gavriel lists are always evolving. Like if you keep up with, for example, the WCC top decks that I do every week, you will see that these lists are changing all the time and people are experimenting with new things as people learn how to play against this deck more and more. And I think especially when this kind of information starts circling more and more in the open, Gavriel players will have to adapt even more. So myself included, I also play Gavriel, not as my main competitive deck, but it's sort of like the punching bag. It's like, all right, if you're serious about Springfest, then you're gonna have to beat this. But then you tell me, I don't play a deck that can actually generate that many resources. I play something aggressive, like Neo Nectar, like plants with Stand Peony. What am I supposed to do then? Not attacking can still be somewhat effective. You are losing out on more because a lot of your plussing is reliant on counterblast sometimes or things like that. And obviously, as a more aggressive deck like plants, you basically need to be dishing out damage from turn 1 onwards if you're going second, or from turn 2 onwards basically as much as possible. And so of course you're lacking in that aggro. But I found that denying counterblast and just like not giving them the opportunity to blow you up in turn 3 is actually still worthwhile, even if you're playing a more aggressive deck that can't farm as much. If your deck really struggles to farm cards, I say farm, I mean just like draw a bunch of cards through effects or whatever other means on your grade 3 turn, the other option for these decks is, for example, to start aggression as early as possible. So just start punching them and pushing them as early as possible, but then guarding, because usually their early game is not as aggressive compared to their grade 3 turn. So you're essentially guarding to stay on 0 the entire time until they go into Hamiel, and then just basically pray that the Hamiel doesn't go up to 6 damage. Like, that is actually, unfortunately, the way to do that, is that you push them while guarding their not so aggressive push, and you're also generating resources while pushing in a lot of these decks, and then you're essentially just saying to the Hamiel, like, all right, I hope you don't 0 to 6 me, everything else I'll try to block. So this, combined with a slight going first advantage, is kind of what you need to exploit against this matchup. And of course, there are plenty of decks that are, you know, maybe not considered as competitive that will still struggle very much against Gavriel, because if your deck just doesn't make as many resources, if it's more, you know, I'm thinking of random decks right now, like Blouse, I guess, don't actually farm that much. Like, they have a big board, but not so much of a big hand, and they kind of like aggress with a bunch of axle attacks. But there will be plenty of decks that really struggle against this matchup. You have to like grind it out, and the smallest plays will literally make a big difference on like how you guard, how you proceed, whether you can underswing and things like that. And so it's definitely worth testing. And so if you have a friend that plays Gavriel, if you know someone in your playtesting group that has a Gavriel deck, whether online or in person, you want to probably face that deck the most possible, because no matter how the meta evolves now, like, there will be a lot of different decks from Clan Selection 1 and 2 combined that you're probably gonna have to face in Springfest. But I honestly don't think there's any other matchup that is actually as much of a like knowledge check as Gavriel. Like, every other matchup you can like play a few games against and like grind it out, learn what the deck does, and then you still just like play on a more or less even footing. Gavriel, you really need to know this matchup knowledge to be able to beat it consistently, and chances are the top tables of Springfest or of shop leagues or whatever big event you're participating in, you might be running into this matchup. So I really recommend to study it, learn it, use these tips to improve, and see what you can do against it. And don't forget that a Gavriel deck has a maximum of 6 rescue checks per turn. So there are 6 shots for them to hit a crit onto a Hamiel, one of them being the Hamiel's actual skill, plus 2 drive checks. So 8 shots. Count these as they're doing them, so you know how much to expect the power to go up as it goes, and how to adapt your guarding and whether you can actually survive that turn. The Gavriel deck is still basically a casino. Like, it's basically a lottery, and you're just seeing how many crits you can flip onto a Hamiel in order to destroy your opponent. And so it's important to keep that in mind. This deck is, while the pop-off, the absolute high roll is, you know, basically 0 to 6 and absolutely decimates you. I've watched so many players in tournaments basically just go like, all right, 6 rescue checks plus 2 drive checks, 1 crit. Well, guess I lose. You know, things like that, they definitely happen, and you have to keep those in mind as well. So just test against this matchup as much as possible. See how much your win rate is compared to how many crits your opponent checks onto a Hamiel, etc, etc. There's so many different ways you can test against it, but I really recommend to learn this matchup and be careful against it, much like how you would be against any other dominant deck in the meta. Because outside of this deck, everything else is really, like, a lot of people would say this isn't even the best deck in the meta right now. There are better decks, and even in the West I've heard people say like Gavriel, maybe like the 3rd best deck, because if it low rolls, it barely does anything, right? It just hits you for 30k swings here, you know, maybe a crit here and there that you can guard much easier. It's just that nasty Hamiel pop-off that is really disgusting, and the Holy Seraph No Seal that enables it. Of course, there's a chance that they might just like randomly hit Holy Seraph No Seal and not let it be usable in Gavriel decks before Springfest even happens, but the way things are looking and how much Japan doesn't seem to be thinking of Gavriel as a real threat anymore, I don't really see that happening anymore. But anyway, that's going to be it for today's video. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Hope this was also helpful for those of you that are looking competitively at Vimium this year with Springfest and everything in mind. But on that note, that's going to be it for me today, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.